My question is for Paul Engel. You had mentioned landscape feature or adding landscape feature, and I'm wondering where that would go.
Yeah, you're talking about within the National Register. Yeah, I was talking about the category of properties. You know, when you're nominating a historic property, it's got to fit building, structure, object, site, or district. And so part of when I was sort of looking at the nomination for the Drakes Bay Historic and Archaeological District, there are these features that really come to the front as sort of very significant in terms of making the landscape sort of readable, and to the extent that it's sort of experiential in that way. And these are things like the White Cliffs, those landscape features that aren't human-constructed things. So I was thinking that in addition to those 5 building, structure, object, site, district, there could be something for landscape feature that would allow you to sort of call out those things. And then they could be on that list of contributing resources and sort of at the front cover of your nomination. People know, aha, that's important as a feature for preservation. And then the other idea was that you could alternatively, instead of just having a district, how we typically think of it, you could have something that functioned fairly similar. It'd be called a landscape. And then that would sort of call out that there are these features that are more like natural landscape features that also are contributing. So that was kind of the idea.
Thanks.
Hmm?
Bert, you mentioned that the offshore wrecks in Fort Jefferson might be considered as a single landscape or an NHL, and with the archaeology, underwater archaeology, a contributing factor, or it might be considered a landscape on its own. And my question is, why would you want to consider it a landscape? What advantage of a landscape on its own versus a district on its own would there be, calling it a landscape versus a district?
Well, right now, I mean, they're neither, obviously, and they are within the park, so they're already protected in that sense. But for us, I think those construction wrecks are unique to Fort Jefferson. Something I forgot to point out is those third system forts, the rest of them are all on land. You know, you could take the construction material however they did by land, but this island is it's an island. Everything came by sea. So I think making that designation, because it is unique, and tying it to Fort Jefferson, I think that tells part of the story. You know, the visitors, it is difficult to get there. When you get there, you look at the fort, you walk around the fort, and I think a lot of the visitors don't even contemplate how they got the material there, and then the fact that there are so many of these wrecks that are littered around the reefs that they just drove their boats through. I think that's why I feel the designation would be important. It tells the broader story of the construction of a fort that was never finished at a time, you know, during the Civil War, where the bricks from the south all of a sudden stopped and they had to bring bricks from the north. And I mean, that's kind of part of the story that is missing, that the visitors maybe don't hear about. You know, they want to go see Dr. Mudd's cell at Fort Jefferson, and they don't really hear the rest of it. So I think that's kind of why I thought of, you know, adding the wrecks to the monument story is important.
Yeah, I think in the NR we would struggle with why the need for a landscape. You could do that just through a district nomination.
Right.
Even a discontinuous district nomination.
I guess if it was a landscape, maybe that could also, I think one of the problems that we have, period, with underwater archaeology is telling the whole story and telling the public about what they can't see underwater. And if it was a landscape, maybe that landscape is broader than just the construction wrecks and the activity that I was specifying, but perhaps the landscape has to deal with the whole landscape of the Dry Tortugas and the end of the Florida Keys, the Florida Straits, and you actually make that nomination include the other cultures, the Spanish wrecks that are there as well, the British wrecks that are there, and that becomes a larger, but at that point you're getting into the entire South Florida and the whole coast of Florida at that point, if you want to make a landscape that includes all the maritime activity throughout.
There were some more questions in the back. Thank you. This is kind of triggered by Paul's presentation about the St. Croix. You're talking about the wing dams on the river. If you really want to try to deal with the St. Croix as like a maritime cultural landscape, you think of the watershed, because so much of the watershed was so integrated into the whole logging activities for that area. But the National Riverway is just along the river, and not all of its tributaries that played such a crucial role in the logging history of the area. So I'm thinking that maybe something like the National Heritage Area program could be a mechanism by which we can incorporate large areas that are really reflected when we try to deal with a maritime cultural landscape. We can't make every one like Apostle Islands, a national park that includes a huge area, but something like heritage areas where we're integrating recreational programs and contemporary usage into preservation and promotion could be a valuable way to try to get this done.
I just had a quick comment on that. Part of what my paper, like the boundary issue, and for the Park Service as far as management, yes, it's not just the riverway. It is the tribute. It's where they took the logs. It's even where the logs came from, where they were going. That could all be exactly. I don't disagree with what you're saying at all. But as far as managing, I don't have an answer for how the Park Service would manage those other areas. Yes, they could just be part of the same heritage area in the district, even maybe a district as a whole. But I think it would be difficult for the park to carve away any of their budget for areas outside of their boundary. So that's where I don't have an answer for that.
Just as a point of comment, there are people who are working on a national heritage area along the St. Croix Riverway. I've spoken with them on a number of occasions in about the last 3-4 years now that I've been working on it. So, Ted, your comments were right on the money, I think.
Okay, and we'll take one more question from the audience, and then we have a question from our people tuned in, and then we'll go to break just so we can stay on schedule. So
thank you. I wanted to make sure our last speaker got her answer to her question. Yes. It should be considered part of the maritime cultural landscape and not just a discrete mining facility. I also wanted to make an observation related to the challenge of the lighthouse nomination. As somebody who has over 5,000 miles sailing on the Great Lakes, and I look at the landscape of the Great Lakes from the water side, not from the land side, we need to somehow, in our nomination paperwork, the way we describe about these maritime cultural landscapes, we need to make sure we include the perspective from the deck and not just from the shore. And when you look at and describe what it's like being from the deck of a ship or a vessel and the importance of those points of light and what you're seeing in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning going through a difficult part of the waterway, it makes sense. And I think somehow in our narratives related to putting these nominations together, we tend to forget the perspective from the deck.
thank you. Okay, and then we have some questions from off-site.
We do. We have a couple of questions from online. We have one from Richard for Julie. He just wanted to say great paper, first of all. But also his question involves what you consider the difference between what you term as an interface and portages, as they're generally thought of.
That's a good question. I'm looking at the interface as kind of the shoreline, or where the water, the lake shore in most cases, meets the land. And when he's talking about the portage, I think, or when most people talk about a portage, they're talking about the distance overland between these two water bodies. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a maritime archaeologist, but I do like to kayak. So that's how I conceive of it. I think they're completely related, and maybe we don't need the distinction. Does that answer his question?
I hope so.
And you have one more?
Yeah, we have one more. This one, I believe, is for Dave Cooper. It said, regarding the lighthouses, in regard to maritime landscapes, are you planning on considering the area within arc of visibility and or the scope of audible and visible signals within the district?
Yeah, good question. Not audible. That's not come up. In any case, the fog signals are gone now, so there's no resource to hear any longer. But we do, part of the veg clearing that we talked about is very much keeping in mind the perspective from the water. And the Coast Guard still has an easement on these structures. They're active aids to navigation. So we need to keep them visible. We go beyond the minimum because we're trying to create a semblance of the historical scene there as well. So yes, the visible arc of those lights is important and was important in the landscape management considerations.